talks. Let's get started. The next session will be about the two topics I like most personally. It's Drupal and automation with Chef. So, without any delay, cloudy with a chance of chickens, I give you Seth Cohen.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Let's get started here. We had a little technical difficulty. We will get that going. Microsoft PowerPoint. Don't count on it.
Diddy who gonna sit do? Jeber spear horn der sterken bork bork bork. English burn der Swedish meatball. You is burn der saltste meatball. Jeber du, das bort der is die goed. Je bent dus die zure moed. Is een beansy bouncy burger, hè? Een servesy burger komt zo. Is weer een zure goed, is weer. Even zure goed. 15 love.
All right, so what do we call that? Well, clearly that was the meatball service. And it had high availability. All right, so welcome to Drupal Chef, Bork, Bork, Bork. So who am I? Well, I'm Seth Cohen everywhere on Drupal.org, Twitter, etc. I am an alpha geek, that's what my business cards say. For a day job, I am the technical lead at Bioraft, and I've been doing Drupal for about 9 years, since 4.6 days. I did tech edit a book, Pro Drupal 7 for Windows developers, which I'm very pleased is the only book that actually analyzed Drupal 7 in terms of the technical behind the scenes, how a page is actually built. There's a chapter in there that if you work with Drupal 7 and you really want to know what exactly happens in order to generate that page, it actually is documented all the way through so that you actually understand what happens to generate that page. And that's the piece of the book I'm most proud of, is we went through with a fine-tooth comb and really made sure it was accurate. I'm a former politician. I actually took 2 years off from Drupal and got elected to the New Hampshire State House and got open source, open data passed into law. So I'm one of those activist tech geeks. And I'm actually really proud of that. I think that's going to help change the world. And Drupal is definitely part of that. And finally, I'm a Muppety man, or am I a manly Muppet? I'm still not sure which. So what is Bioraft? Well, I just describe it as preventing the next zombie apocalypse. My marketing people aren't that happy with it, but they were okay with this slide. So it is built entirely using Drupal. It's the software as a service model, so we provide everything. We provide lab safety, compliance, and training software. We do things like track hazards, compliance management, training delivery. Basically, if you're in one of the institutions at quite a number of universities and some pharmaceutical companies that use our services, if you at all enter into a lab, we track who you are, what kind of lab you're in, what kind of training you've had, etc. Make sure that the labs are safe. So we're talking about data and important real-world consequences if that machine goes down, if that data gets lost, etc. This is not a hobby site by any means. This has got real-world consequences, which is kind of why I joke about the next zombie apocalypse, because we've all seen those movies, and what is it that usually causes those things? It's some guy who goes ahead, reaches into a rat cage, gets bit, and says, oh, it'll be okay, I'll go home. And next thing you know, half the world's gone and zombies are everywhere. So as long as there has not been a zombie apocalypse, I'm doing my job. So what are we covering today? We are going to cover Chef. What is it? Why use it? We're going to cover the basic terms in what I call Drupalish. So basically, you currently speak Drupal. Chef uses a different language. My goal is for you to walk out of here understanding what Chef does in terms of how you understand Drupal. We're going to look at a very simple example, a lamp stack. There are certainly a lot more complicated things that can be done, but in the interest of time, we're going to keep it fairly simple. And then finally, some basic issues and tips. And so we see there the most interesting Swedish man in the world who says, I don't always deploy lots of servers, but when I do, I use a chef. So why chef? Well, it's right there, time and money. Chef is a way to build stable servers for development and production which save you time and money. And well, what do we mean by that? Well, without Chef, right now, how do you build and maintain your existing servers? Who does it? Do you use package management? Do you use scripts? Do you build everything from source code, combinations? Who manages those scripts? When? What happens if there's an update? Security? OS level changes. Oh, well, we were using Debian 6 and now Debian 7's out, so we're going to have to upgrade everything. Or Ubuntu released a set of patches that, yeah, they broke something. We have to roll things back. There's all kinds of things that come up. Do you use virtual machines? Do you use physical machines? Do you push stuff out to Amazon? You push something out to Amazon and it works great, and then one day the server disappears, and of course Amazon says, well, not our problem. We don't guarantee 100% availability. It's 99.99, and you just happen to be the 1 in 10,000 that disappeared today. So these are important questions if you're dealing with any kind of reliability. Personnel changes, that's the last thing, the bus factor. You've got a great person, maybe you're that person who's maintaining servers, and if you got hit by a bus tomorrow, what would happen to the service? What if you were not available for a week? What if you want to go on vacation? Wouldn't it be nice to know that your servers are going to stay up and you're not sitting with a pager? Do we all have pagers anymore? Does anybody have, is it all phones now at this point? Basically, it would be nice to know you have reliability. Well, that's what Chef is about. That's what we're focusing on. So this is not another what is DevOps talk. There's a whole track. This is one answer. This is not the only answer. There's lots of other pieces to this puzzle, but my goal is that you walk out of here basically going, I'm going to go implement Chef because it is a piece of the puzzle that I'm going to use. And I hope it fits for you. So what is Chef? It's from a company called Opscode. And it's about turning infrastructure into code, because we all know that once you turn it into code, you can control it. You can version control it, you can back it up, you can track your changes, so that when somebody changes something and it breaks, you can figure out exactly who and when that change happened. Most people don't have their servers under version control, and so they go, yeah, I think we did something last week, but it wasn't me, I think it was the other guy. This solves that. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take everything that is your infrastructure, turn it into code, and gain all the advantages that we already know code control is good for. So Opscode describes it as configuration templates with business logic to describe infrastructure and establish relationships between boxes, which is a fancy way of saying that it's not a simple script. There's a lot of complexity to this, not only to describe it, but it actually allows some interaction. So start slow, build up, that's one of the things. Chef has a lot of pieces. Chef has a steep learning curve. You don't need to do it all at once. If you add complexity slowly, Chef lets your servers work together. So you will start rolling things out, and as you add new pieces, you say, I'm going to add logging, and you can add logging, and your existing servers can basically, if you've written your scripts right, start to get logging as soon as that new server comes up. 15 minutes later, they might recognize, hey, there's a logging server. I need to go and I need to start sending my logs to them. You don't have to start with that. You can add the building blocks to it. So don't feel like you have to solve everything with Chef to start with. So we know Drupal. Can we learn Chef? I think so, and that's the goal of this talk. So we're not covering, because there's a lot of things we could talk about. We're not going to cover Chef versus Puppet versus other tools. This is a Chef talk. I've been to Chef talks where somebody says, well, what about Puppet? Well, Puppet's another answer. I have decided to use Chef for a variety of reasons, and that's what I'm going to focus on. If somebody wants to play with Puppet, please feel free. I will tell you right now, I think you're going to come back to Chef after you play with it. Vagrant. Vagrant's a great tool for spinning up virtual machines. I highly recommend it. Again, it's beyond the scope of the talk. We could do a whole hour just on Vagrant. BORK Shelf. BORK Shelf, it sits on top of Chef. It's a way to speed up development. Once you understand the basics, you will appreciate what BORK Shelf does. There's some great videos on it. But again, I'm trying to teach the basics, so we're not, but definitely, and I've got it mentioned at the end, this is something you want to look at because what they did was they said, well, this is great. This is the way it normally works. Is there a way to do it faster and better? And BORK Shelf was the result. And there are Chef developers out there who thank God that BORK Shelf exists because it speeds up. So instead of waiting 10 minutes, you might wait 30 seconds to test your changes. We're not going to cover Chef Solo, which is a way to do some of this stuff just locally on your own machine, because my goal, again, is show you the basics. I want you to walk out of here understanding the core concept of Chef, and Chef Solo sort of bypasses that. We're not going to cover Spice Weasel. That's too futuristic. You'll come back in 1,000 years. We're not going to cover Food Critic and a lot of other nifty tools. There's a bunch of Chef add-ons. I definitely recommend looking at all of that stuff, but again, we're going to keep it really simple today. My goal is you walk out of here and say, I want to know more about Chef. I'm not satisfied with what I learned. I want to learn more, and there are resources. So, cooking for geeks. Learning Chef begins by understanding the language. And if you don't speak the lingo, it's all Greek. It's all mock Swedish. So we all speak Drupalish. We're going to start with Drupal. So here's the Chef terms we're going to learn. You can see there's a little roadmap there. And we're going to come back to this list. And hopefully by the time we have gone through these slides, you will go, oh, okay, I understand what they mean by this as opposed to what we mean. So, how is Chef like Drupal? Well, I have here a slide that shows the latest fork from Drupal. We've all heard of Backdrop, etc. This is Drupal, which is the Swedish Chef fork of Drupal. No. My goal here was to basically show that we can look at something, and even if you don't speak the language, you can understand it in the same terms you're used to understanding, because that actually is, I found a Firefox add-on that rewrites the site into mock Swedish, and so that's actually what that is. So how can we understand Chef concepts? Well, let's compare it to what we understand for Drupal concepts. So Chef uses Ruby. So what? How many people here got started with Drupal and weren't necessarily wizards in PHP? There's a few. You can learn to use Chef without knowing Ruby. It helps, but if you 5-10 minutes, you will have enough Ruby knowledge to get started. You do not need to know Ruby in order to use Chef. Actually, the most useful thing is one of the same things that it's useful to know for Drupal, which is JSON formatting. And that's becoming more and more important with things like Drupal 8, because as YAML, all of these things are very structured text documents. And if you make a mistake in the configuration, it doesn't work. Chef uses those same things. So we have the core word. We all know the word, the node. Everybody knows what it is. It's an item of content in Drupal, right? Well, a node is not a node by any other name, because in Chef, node means something completely different. A node is a complete website. It's a complete server. A node is a virtual machine with whatever it's running and all of the various pieces. So that's the first thing, is we're used to thinking of a node as a discrete item. Well, it is a discrete item for Chef. It's a discrete server instance. When they talk about a workstation, they mean your laptop. They mean whatever it is you do your work in. It's your local development environment. Chef server is the central control. Think of it as your own private Drupal.org. What goes up to the Chef server is code you consider to be either ready for production, or it's your development environment if you're using some versioning, and all of your nodes out there talk back to this machine and basically say, hey, do you have any updates for me? And that updater is the Chef client that runs on each of them. So we're all used to the updater. We have that in Drupal. We know that you can go and run the updater and it'll tell you, hey, there's a new version out there on Drupal.org, or there's a security update, or et cetera. It's exactly the same concept. Each of your nodes talks back to your Chef server and says, hey, I'm server X. I need to know, is there anything waiting for me? And if there is, it gets the instructions and it basically downloads and does all the updates. So repository, that's, again, we're familiar with that. It's code control. Now, in the case of Chef, for the most part, it's Git. There's a lot of development on GitHub. There is quite a community out there. Now, this is my favorite. This is Knife. So we have the equivalent of Knife when it comes to Drupal. It's called Drush. If you're not using Drush, you should be. Drush is awesome. Drush is basically the command line tool that does everything that you'd need to do in Drupal. And Knife is exactly the same thing for Chef. Knife is the way you can do 95% or maybe 99% of the stuff you're ever going to do with Chef. You're going to do it from a command line. You're going to do a Knife command and you're going to say, I need to upload some new information. I need to check on the status of a server. Knife does all of that. So the metaphor in Chef is they use this cooking metaphor, knife, well, cookbook. Well, what's a cookbook? Well, in Drupal terms, it's a feature. So in Drupal, we have created a packaging system for not just modules, but configuration and all the pieces so that if you go get a feature, you can add it to your website and you know that that complete package comes down and works, sets up all the pieces that are needed. Well, that's what a cookbook is. And there's some overlap because installation profiles and distributions and features are all not quite the same. Cookbooks cover all three of those. A recipe is like a module. So the usual syntax that Chef uses is cookbook : recipe. So bacon : crispy would refer to a file in the repository that you've got under cookbooks /bacon /recipes /crispy.rb, RB being a Ruby file. But if you think of a recipe like a module, you'll be all set. That's really what it is. So what do we say right now? There's a module for that? Well, the answer is there's a recipe for that. You can go looking and you will find there's tons of recipes out there for just about every server task you want. And it may not be perfect, but just like with modules, you can customize them as you need to. And you can write your own to do all the things that you need to do. So a resource is an action. Anything you need to do on the server, I need to add a file, I need to add a user, I need to change a permission, I need to do whatever it is you need to do. Any of those things is termed a resource. Basically, resource collections are recipe, recipe collections are cookbook. Now, if they'd said ingredient, that might have fit the model, but I think they just said resource, it's resource. So a data bag is configuration storage. The closest we have in Drupal might be variables. The idea is these are things that are stored potentially for use by multiple machines. It has fields you can set, mostly done in JSON. So it's a little bit configuration. You can encrypt them. So for instance, you might store your user list. So you might have a list of people who are the users that you would be allowed on a particular machine, and you would have a list of these users and potentially SSH keys, you might have passwords, you might have all of this stuff. It's stored in one place, and every one of those machines would have access to this depending on how you set it up. So templates are how configurations get filled out, and we have the same thing, we call it tokens. The idea of Drupal tokens is that we go ahead and say, here's the token variables and drop them into a form and you get the page. Well, in this case, we're going to take tokens and we're going to use it to fill in the blanks on server configs. So you might have 3 different web servers and the configs are almost identical except for a couple of small changes, and you would just use basic templates so that way you'd have one version and just fill in those changes on a server by server basis. So config files are like a .info file. That looks a lot like the standard module.info file. And if you look at it, we have dependencies, and we have versioning. We have some basic stuff that goes ahead and describes what the thing is and who's responsible for it. And that's basically what it does. This, in this case, is a Drupal recipe. And we're going to come back and look at this a little later. Actually, we'll mention it later, but you can see right there on that line, it says depends, and it basically loops through and says this has got dependencies on PHP and Apache 2 and MySQL and OpenSSL. So Chef will know that in order to run Drupal, you need to have these resources installed first. So it's smart. It knows that you can't build Drupal unless you have all those pieces. Now you might say, well, I don't use MySQL. We're building Drupal sitting on top of MongoDB. Well, great. So you make a recipe that has a MongoDB dependency instead, and there's your customization. So libraries are raw code. You will occasionally find that a cookbook has some raw Ruby functions in there, occasionally something else. The idea being sometimes you just need to get that level of access. You need to be able to run something directly in a basic language as opposed to through Chef's things. Searching, well, searching is Solar. Everybody's here used Apache Solar. I mean, basically Drupal decided that that was the way to go. So again, nothing you're not familiar with. It's nice when you use some of the same tools. So roles. Roles are server identities. So for instance, we say these servers over here are web servers, and these servers over here are database servers, and that's a logging server, and you can then identify these things as groups. So you can say, hey, web servers, go find out who the logging server is and send your logs over there. And you never need to specify IP addresses or names or anything else, and Chef will essentially take care of all of that for you and will make the connections as needed. Again, this allows you to build things slowly and also have a lot of redundancy because you can say go send stuff to the logging servers, and maybe you have 2 or 3 of them, and then when one goes down, the others are there, and 15 minutes after that machine goes down, the other servers get updated and they go, oh, well, there's only 2 machines now. I'll remove that other one, and therefore they just keep running and they don't sit there and try to send logs to some non-existent machine because that machine was taken down for maintenance. So this way, these servers are never going to give you up. They're never going to let you down. They're never going to run around and desert you. Oh, I'm sorry. It seems this presentation has been rickrolled.
Well, that sure made us LOL.
Laugh out loud?
No, lose our lunch.
I'm even bringing my own hecklers. There we go. All right. So attributes are properties. So now we're getting to some of the JSON formatted stuff. This should look pretty familiar. And I'm not going to go over all the details here, but the basic concept is you have a run list that says what recipes to run. So in this case, that configuration for a machine says you're going to run Drupal. Remember, we talked that Drupal has dependencies, so it knows that if it's going to run Drupal, it needs to have these other pieces in place. It has, you can see there, a Drupal DB password setting, which is a random string. One of the nice things about Chef is, for the most part, the recipes are written so that if you don't specify a setting, it will generate a random one for you. So if you tell it to build a Chef instance of, say, Drupal, and you haven't pre-told it what the password's supposed to be for the database, it will make one up and it will store it in a config file. And you don't have to go figure it out. You just have to open the config file up because it's right there. Now, in the case of the next thing down, the MySQL settings, I actually specified those just to show that you can put them in. So in this case, when I built that config, I actually said these are the root password and Debian passwords I want you to use for this particular config. And because I put them in there, when Chef goes to set up MySQL, it says, oh, I know what that variable is. I don't need to go create a random one. I'll use the existing one. And then there's a name, and then there's environment. Chef does have environments. I didn't really touch on that here. But essentially, you can do things like build the same server in different environments. So you can say, build this machine this way if it's my production server, but build it this way if it's set as the staging environment or the development environment. And that way you have one set of recipes that can potentially behave differently depending on how you're using them. So that way maybe your development environment ignores certain errors because it just doesn't have the production pieces it's looking for. So that way you don't get all kinds of warning messages and you go, oh yeah, just ignore that. I need to fix my script. You can just make your script work the first time that it pays attention to what the environment is. So, node, workstation, chef server, chef client, repository, knife, cookbook, recipe. We talked about configs and attributes. Policies are basically all of those things with it's all your settings. Resources, data bag, templates, libraries, and roles. So, if you look at that thing, you now understand the basics. And you can see they're really not that much different. I mean, there's a little bit of difference, but there is certain similarities. It is a very structured system for building servers as opposed to Drupal, which is a structured system for building websites. So let's take a practical example. You are tasked with setting up Chef to build a new staging server for your team. How do you start? We're going to keep it really simple. We're going to say the requirements for the new server are just a lamp stack. That's it. That's the only thing we care about. We don't care about a firewall. We don't care about log. We're not setting any of that up. Somebody says, hey, I need you to spin up a new lamp stack for me. How many people have had problems with just getting lamp stack set up? Yeah. All right, so bare metal, and this is one of our goals of Chef, is that essentially you can, through having your configuration and code, your data backed up, so whether that's your MySQL dump or however you're storing your data, some kind of backup, and having your code like Drupal all in repositories, you could essentially bring up a brand new machine from bare metal and have it be exactly the same every time. So how will it be provisioned? Well, it could be a physical box, it could be a virtual box, maybe Amazon Web Server. You've got a variety of OS choices. You'll pick one. In this case, let's say we're going to build it on Ubuntu, and we're going to say that it's a virtual box. Doesn't really matter. So the next step is to get Chef Server. Now, you can set up Chef Server on your own. It's open sourced. Opscode provides a free trial of their hosted solution called Enterprise Chef to get your feet wet. That's a great way to get started. I recommend it. You don't need to set anything up. You just go, you say, hey, give me a free account. They say, sure, give us your email, and you're ready to go. And they then will walk you through installing Chef on your workstation. And essentially that one line, which is it just goes and gets a script and runs it, that's the magic. In some way, shape, or form, that script or what that script does runs on every single machine that's part of what you're doing. That script will install all of the Chef tools, all of the Chef clients and servers, everything you need to make your machines talk to each other. So once you run that, it basically installs all the pieces, including Ruby, the whole works. It basically looks at your system and says, what do I need to make this functional? And it does it. So they've got the magic down to one line. If you basically memorize that line, you can sit down at any machine you need to, and boom, you've got a Chef workstation, which is great when your laptop decides to act up and you need to grab a friend's laptop. So now you have to decide on which cookbooks you're going to install. And so you can go to, among other places, the community site for Opscode, where they have essentially their modules list, if you think about it that way, a features list. They have hundreds, if not thousands, of recipes, cookbooks for all kinds of services and machines and programming languages, etc. So it's just like going to Drupal.org. You basically say, oh, I need this, and oh, I heard really good things about that. I want to try that out. So in this case, we're going to say, okay, knife, I know what cookbooks I want. So I type the command knife cookbook site install Apache 2 MySQL PHP. And knife says, oh, okay. So you're telling me go to the main repository site and go grab the Apache 2 cookbook, the MySQL cookbook, and the PHP cookbook. And by the way, any dependencies that it has. So there's a couple of small dependencies that some of those want. And it will churn for a little bit. It will go download stuff, and you will end up with some Git repository files for each of those. And you can, at that point, commit them into your local code repository, and you're all set. But we need to send that to the Chef server. That's our own private server. In this case, it's hosted, but they don't put anything into it. You don't have to worry about, oh, they have a version of this or a version of that. They give you the blank slate. They just say it's empty. You put into it what you want. So you don't have to worry about, oh, they have an obsolete version. There's nothing in it. The only way that things get in is because you put them in. So we say, knife cookbook, upload all, and it goes boom, 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 and it sends it all to the Chef server, and voila, just like in the Matrix, Chef knows Kung Fu. So now we tell Chef to control our new server. That's the virtual machine we said we were going to set up. So the only thing that's on that machine is we basically formatted our virtual machine. We said install Ubuntu because that's what we're going to use. So whatever you're used to using, maybe you use Windows. Whatever it is, we basically just do a knife command from our workstation, and we say knife bootstrap, the IP of the server, and then we give it an SSH user, and we tell it to sudo, so it's got some root access so it can install packages. And we say, okay, here's what I want you to run. Go install MySQL, Apache 2, and PHP. That one command SSHs over to your new virtual box. It says, is Chef on here? We didn't put Chef on it, so it goes and it runs that nice script. It goes and it grabs all the Chef stuff, puts that on, and then says, oh, I've been told to put MySQL, Apache 2, and PHP onto it. It goes, looks at those cookbooks, and it says, oh, there's some dependencies there, and it goes and it basically will bootstrap the entire thing. And when it finishes, and depending on the speed of your machines and the internet, it might take 30 seconds, it might take 10 minutes, it depends on how complicated a recipe you do. Basically, when it finishes, you have a LAMP server. You're done. You don't need to do anything else. You might not want to tweak some configs, et cetera, because that was a very simple recipe. We didn't customize it at all. But basically, with what did we do? 3 commands. Go grab some stuff. Go push some stuff up to the server. Go bootstrap a thing. Now, if we wanted to do a second machine, you don't have to do those first 2 steps. They're done. You just go and put another IP address in there, and you're done. There's another machine, and it's identical to the first machine, except maybe it has a different IP address. You could customize it again, but the goal here is replicability, and so it's really simple to do it. So, all right, but we didn't put Drupal on. Let's bring it back to Drupal. So let's use a Drupal cookbook that we looked at earlier. So it has the dependencies for MySQL, PHP, and Apache 2. So the only line we would have had to have done is cookbook site install Drupal, because that recipe knew that we needed all the other things. So that has built into it the fact that you need a LAMP stack. So we, don't even have to go provision anything. Somebody says, hey, go spin me up another Drupal server. There's your command. And then you run your bootstrap command. Only in this place you'd go recipe Drupal, and you wait for it to churn. And you go, okay, yeah, new machine, here's the IP address. Go ahead. Starting up servers has never been easier, especially when they're virtual machines, because you can basically go ahead and spin up as many as you need as quick as possible. So let's talk a little bit about configuration pieces. Things to put in data bags. We talked about this a little bit. These are things you don't want to put in a recipe. Think of recipes as sort of public. I mean, you can still have private recipes, but if you get an Apache recipe, you might say, I need to set up certain Apache users or MySQL users or whatever the case may be. So things like SSL certificates, passwords, users, these are things that are private data. You put those into a data bag. They get stored encrypted if you want them to be on your Chef server. And so you do have a little bit of an issue there because you still have to control who has access to your Chef server. So there are still some security issues. You don't necessarily want everybody who has access to your Chef server, for instance, to be able to add a new user to the system. So that's one caveat you want to make sure that you're paying attention to. So use Ubuntu if you can. I wish somebody had told me this sooner. I started using Chef, and I've been a Debian fan for years. I've used Ubuntu, I like it, but I was like, oh, well, Debian's really solid. You know, they long cycle, and I usually know I can trust the packages are absolutely solid. And the problem is, it's the lack of eyeballs. You end up with a lot of scripts, a lot of recipes that only work on things that people have tested it on. Well, if you want maximum compatibility, use Ubuntu, use the long-term, the LTS images. I highly recommend it. I think in the long run, just in terms of comfort to know that there's lots of other people out there using it, you're going to be the happiest. But to be clear, Chef will run on anything. It will control Windows boxes. If you've got Windows boxes, you want to be able to reliably bring up the same Windows box every single time, building it from a static image. FreeBSD, every flavor of Unix, OS X, if you're running for some reason Mac servers. You obviously have got, for some reason, a lot of money to spend, but that's great, you know. I mean, if that's what you want, you know, I'm not sure why you wouldn't be using Microsoft at that point if you get a lot of money. All right, so this is a classic Drupalism, don't hack core. The same lesson applies. If you're downloading a cookbook, yes, there are times you might change it, but if you change it, you're making it harder on yourself, because when that cookbook gets updated, you're going to have to figure out the changes. Build on top. Build custom things that sit on another layer. So take the standard cookbook and then build your own custom little recipes that sit on top of that and run those recipes. Don't go hacking the standard cookbooks. You will be glad you didn't do that. For the same reason you're glad you don't hack core, because basically you're killing kittens. And contribute your patches back. It's really nice. I have one I've got to give back where I discovered that for some reason I was using a user creation cookbook, and it allowed me to set a password, which was great. So I could set up a default password for the users. So I'd spin up a server, and they could log in because they knew what their default password was, and everybody had a different default password. The problem is that Chef client runs regularly. Usually you put it into a cron job, and you just tell it to run every so often, let's say every 15 minutes, so that way it keeps checking. Well, unfortunately, what would happen was every 15 minutes it would check, and if they had logged in and changed their password, it would go change their password back. It would basically force their password back to the default. And I said, I don't want that behavior. I want to set a default password and make it so that when they change it, you leave it alone. And I found a way to do it, and I just haven't had a chance to submit that patch back. But that's on my to-do list, is to add that back in. It's a great example where how many other people might find that useful? Quite a lot. So, one cookbook to rule them all. It's really tempting to build separate cookbooks for all your pieces. We're all used to compartmentalizing and trying to make sure that, you know, you keep your projects separate. I did that, and then I was kind of sorry I did, because the way servers tend to work is there's a lot of interdependency, and you end up with sort of this really nasty web of dependencies. And what I found was easier was, for instance, firewalls. I had a custom firewall cookbook, and what I realized is that I don't have one firewall. I have a lot of firewalls. I have a firewall setting depending on whether I'm running a particular service. So really what I should have is I should have in with what sets that service up, the firewall instructions. And that way I spread it apart. So the only time those firewall instructions go into a box is if I'm putting the important pieces, like the service that I'm firewalling off. Because of that, your best bet is to start from, I'm going to build a custom cookbook and put all your recipes into that. And don't break it apart, at least to begin with. It's really nice to be able to say, hey, I'm going to contribute stuff back, and I've got this one cookbook I want to do. Build yourself a cookbook that's got everything, and then at some point go, these 3 or 4 things are really worth sharing, and put that out. But don't split it up at first, because I think you'll be sorry, because it gets way more complicated. It's not like building something that doesn't have dependencies. When you start having 5 or 6 servers that have interdependencies and slight different changes, it's really nice to know that there's one place to go look, that you're not sitting there going, now which cookbook did I put that in? So that brings me to the next point, which is record your changes. And make sure your coworkers record their changes. Because there's nothing worse than having a coworker who says, oh yeah, there was a problem with such and I went in and I tweaked a config file. And you're waiting and they don't say anything. You go, what config file did you tweak? Oh, I don't remember. Well, you can figure it out. It'll be okay. Well, if you really are careful about documenting your changes, you will put them back into your recipes. Because the goal of Chef is every change that happens should end up in a recipe. In fact, your production machines you should never have to even log into, ideally, because every single change that happens should be under version control, should be in a recipe, should be something that you can document and say when it happened and when it took effect. And if you log into a particular box and you tweak a config setting, it might be perfectly fine. And then 3 weeks later, you change something and Chef client runs and, oh, wait, that configuration changed. And you may not even remember what tweak you made, and now you're back to square one. So document your changes. Chef works if you work it. If you break the habit of one-off fixing your servers, you will be much better off. So, questions? Are there any questions? Okay, you want to use the mic?
Hi, my name is Sean. I had a brief test of the server, and I was wondering how open source it is, because when I tried to download it, it wasn't so easy. I didn't find a Git repository. I know you can test and use the online enterprise version, but I couldn't find a GitHub repository. I had to fill out a form, and then I got a tarball to download. And it just made me wonder, you know.
It's actually very open source. They do have extensions that they have done for hosting, and they freely admit that. I mean, that's their business model, is if you are big enough that you need some of their extra services because you're running that many servers, they want to sell you that service. I believe that you can just download it from GitHub. If we had the web here, I could show you. But basically, if you go to Opscode, they do offer download the Chef server. I'm running the open source server because I just decided in my business case, we actually have to keep certain sensitive data. And so we just decided that having an internally run Chef server made the most sense because we're having to maintain all the other information anyway. In this way, it's completely self-contained. I never have to go make queries outside of the local organization. So it is open. It is completely open source. There's a couple of pieces that are fairly advanced that, no, they're not in the open source one. But
no, what I mean, I know the license is open source, but I was wondering how accessible it really is. And have you any experience in the community in submitting patches or?
Yes, in fact, actually, I've submitted quite a number of bug reports, and all the ones that I've submitted, including questions when I had an issue, got answered right away. They basically use GitHub. I mean, it really does. Most, I would say 95% of the stuff you're going to find is being hosted on GitHub. And I've had things where I went ahead and I said, hey, I'm getting this error message, and I had a developer come back and go, oh yeah, you're using too old a version of Ruby, and it turns out he was absolutely right. That machine, I actually had too old a version of Ruby. I was getting an error because of that, which is pretty good support because, I mean, he could have just shrugged and said, I don't know, I don't have that error. He actually had the answer, which was look on my local machine, and he was right. So in terms of availability of the community, I think it's awesome. I would say that you're going to find almost every major server piece that any of us here have to build, there's probably, if not a Chef recipe already done, at least something that will point you in the right direction. I did have to build some custom recipes. We're doing some stuff with Shibboleth, for instance, for being able to do custom user sign-on things. And it turns out that the Shibboleth stuff that existed didn't work for me. But, I mean, my custom script is 2 files, 3 files. I mean, it really is not much. And that's the thing, is that the models are out there that even if there's nothing that's exactly what you need, you can find something that gives you the pointers so you can build what you need to do. Obviously, you need to understand how to build a server to begin with. You need to know how to build whatever piece it is you're going to build anyway to make your script work properly. Being able to say bring up an Apache 2 server is great, but if you don't know how to configure Apache, you're not going to know where the tweaks are you need to make to set them up. Same thing with MySQL tuning. It's not going to do that stuff for you. So this is not going to replace your sysadmins. This is just going to make it so that they can spend time on the important things, not, oh, yeah, boss, I need to bring up a LAMP server. I'll have that tomorrow, because we just saw how easy it is. Now if somebody says, I need to bring up a LAMP server, your answer is, okay, and 5 minutes later?
What's the workflow for handling configuration changes? So, for example, in PHP, you might want to, on one machine, up the max file size, upload file size, but you don't want that to propagate to all the other PHP running machines you've got.
Right. So every single node has a config setting, and basically it's a YAML JSON style file. There is a hierarchy of overrides. So essentially you have the default settings, then you might have settings that are set by PHP, for instance. Then you might have settings that are based on things like roles. So you say all of my web servers have this set, but then ultimately you have sort of the top level, and you can, on a particular machine, do an override. So it will be probably as simple as on that particular machine config. So let's say it's something where PHP needs to have twice as much memory because you got something and it just needs to have that. So you'll go into that one machine, you'll basically build out your JSON array, you'll have something on the order of, say, PHP mem size, let's say 3 gig, whatever it is. And that machine, the very next time the Chef client runs, will actually go in, modify the PHP settings, so PHP INI in most cases, change it to 3, restart the services, and so 15 minutes later, or whatever you've set that cron to, it immediately will take effect. You might then say, oh yeah, that's too much, bring it down to 2. You could tweak it as often as you wanted. You could go ahead and say, I'm going to set one machine this way, one machine this way, one machine this way, run them for a while, and then go look at your logs, and then say, now I want them all to be this. Delete all of those settings and go drop it into, say, maybe a PHP config, and suddenly they all get that. So there's a hierarchy.
Yeah, so then if you install a new machine with PHP, it will take the default setting PHP thing and not the specific machine.
Exactly.
Setting. Okay, thanks.
Hi, I have 2 things. First of all, Amazon Web Services, do you know about Opsworks?
Yes.
Okay.
They have a partnership at this point, and they have actually, as the way I understand it, and I don't work for Opsworks, so I'm not privy to it, but I do understand that it looks like the partnership they have is going to make it easier and easier, because it looks like basically Amazon has decided that in the battle between the various competing platforms, Chef, Puppet, etc., they've decided that Chef is the way to go. So it's going to get much easier to do Chef things, and that's a good example. I just was part of a webinar. I just watched it that went into a knife plugin to work with VMware, for instance. And that's the nice thing, is there's tons of plugins that people are writing for all of these different, virtual platforms, etc. That make. We saw what we were doing there with a Bootstrap. For me to go ahead and not just bootstrap it, but actually just say, go create a new instance of a virtual machine on my VMware server would be, one line. It's that simple. I wouldn't even have to log onto the server. I could actually say, go use this OS image, go drop that into the machine, and then bootstrap it. It'll start from basically no machine at all and bring it up.
Yeah, that's also my experiences, but with Amazon, you wanted to just bring up servers whenever the load is high, and everything has to go totally automatically. I just want to hear if you had experiences or could recommend it.
Yeah, I'm not using Amazon. I've basically been using VMware, but my experiences are pretty similar from what I hear. I mean, I know Acquia is using Amazon with good success. They gave a talk at Portland that I know is online that talks about how they do it. They run quite a big test suite, and it's all spun up using Amazon Web Services. And I remember they said that they actually have a failure rate, that if a machine doesn't come up in 5 to 10 minutes, they basically just assume it's never going to come up and just do it again. I mean, there actually is a measurable failure rate that things just don't work correctly. So, that's why I was joking earlier, because it's absolutely true. Everybody I've heard says Amazon's great when it works.
Something totally different about the don't hack core or don't hack contrib modules, contrib recipes. I tend to find some things, like, for instance, PHP. PHP cookbooks all assume that I'm running Apache. So they have the dependencies. Do I have any way of overriding and say, you don't want to use Apache, you want to use Nginx?
Yes and no. The problem is that you're right, the default cookbooks assume Apache because 90%, 95%, whatever the number is of people who are running PHP are running Apache. I would first go look at some of the things like Nginx recipes and see if somebody's already got a PHP thing that, let's say you're running Nginx, for instance. I will tell you that I actually had to build machines that ran PHP 5.2. And so what I did was I actually copied some of the recipes. I, in this case, said, all right, I cannot generate the image I need from any of the existing recipes, but I can build stuff from source. I took the PHP 5.3 source recipe, because there was a recipe to say build PHP from source and install it. Even though I was working with, Debian and Ubuntu servers, I mean, normally you don't want to do that, but in this case, that was the easiest way to do it. It would actually go download the tarball of 5.2, build it from scratch, all under the control of Chef, which means every time I spun up a server, it would go grab a tarball. And this is a great example of a gotcha. I started getting these things where I'd go to spin up a server and nothing would happen. And I'd sit there and go, what's going on? What's the error? And I'd check into the logs and it had gotten stuck. And it turns out that the archive I was grabbing it from at php.net was down and it wasn't answering. And so therefore I couldn't go grab this tarball and the script would die. My solution for that was I grabbed a tarball and stored it locally. I removed the external dependency because I always wanted the same tarball, but it was really easy to just go and grab it from someplace else until it wasn't there. So it's a good example of you really want to test your scripts, just in general. Assume the rest of the internet is gone. Make sure your stuff still works. Now, DrupalCon's a good test for that, right? Because the rest of the internet is gone. It's just DrupalCon right now.
Hi, my question is partially linked to the story which you just told. I am completely new to Chef, and I would like to know if something goes wrong, how friendly Chef when reporting that something went like in your sample. When you try to execute in your example, like recipe MySQL, for example, something went wrong. And second question, if I apply my custom change to MySQL initialization file, for example, something that went wrong in custom code. So in both cases.
Chef has got amazing logging by default without changing it. When you run Chef client, you can actually see all of the interactions. You get to basically peek behind the scenes between the communication that server has, that the node, the client has with the server. So you can see it says, hello, I'm this particular machine. And the server says, hello machine, I'm validated that yes, you are the right server. Yes, I have something for you. You need this, this, and this. Okay, I don't have that cached. Can you send that to me? Yes. And so you can watch as it streams the things and your client basically caches stuff, so it's holding on to it. And the interesting thing is the next time it runs, if it says I don't need that anymore, it flushes its cache. It doesn't just hang on to everything. They try to be really efficient. But you can watch every single step then that client does running through the various scripts, including everything's good here, I don't need to do anything. Move on to the next step. Move on to the next step. So you can actually just look at that log. So in the case of, for instance, I could basically say, oh, it's trying to go get this file. Oh, why isn't it getting that file? And then I go and I sit there in my local browser and I go and I get server down. So very good debugging abilities because you really can track that stuff. When it comes to custom code, that's actually a really good point. If you make a mistake in JSON formatting, for instance, I tend to sit there and edit config files on the fly. Like I'll sit there and just, I set my editor to nano. So I'm just sitting there editing in a terminal window. The problem with that is if I miss a comma, and as a result, my JSON's invalid, I lose the entire thing. It goes to save it because it's actually doing a live edit. It basically, even though I'm on my workstation, I'm saying go edit this config. It actually goes to the server, gets the config, grabs it locally. I'm editing a local file. And when I hit save, it's going to push it back because I'm actually changing a config file. And if I break it, it says, no, you can't do that. It's a broken file. I'm not even going to push it. And it just loses it. So I was doing a lot of nano stuff. I started using other external editors like TextMate 2, which is really good because you can do things like check stuff for JSON formatting. So it's only as good as your other tools. It's not the only tool in your toolbox.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about build and deployment and how could it be integrated to Chef? Do you have some recommendations?
Well, as I said, start small and grow it. Ideally, you should be able to build a setup where you have your development environment, your staging environment, your production environment, and have them as close as possible within, reasonable limitations. And it's really not hard once you have one built to clone and extend. So in terms of deployment, my deployment strategy is basically I've got scripts that will go and do whatever's needed. Like for instance, for a Drupal install, it goes and it does a checkout of my code, and it goes and it grabs a database backup. Most of the time the most current, but I actually have stuff so I can go grab old database backups, for instance, and it basically will reset everything so that way when the scripts run, I can know that my server's in the state I want it to be, and if I needed to spin up another server for testing purposes, ideally it's going to be exactly where I want it to be.
Okay, so you would roll your own recipes backed by your own scripts?
Well, you are going to need to do that. I mean, obviously it depends on what you're doing. But again, Chef is not going to solve all of your problems. It's just going to give you a structure to build better tools. I've got rollout scripts, for instance, that use water that actually log on to servers and click through some buttons. And my goal is to replace that stuff with Drush. And then my goal is to make Drush be called by a Chef script. So the goal is get it out of being, and it is code right now. It's a recorded script, and it's actually a Ruby script. But it's doing it through a browser, and as a result, I've got a lot of inconsistencies because browsers, what version of Firefox are you running today? So the goal is make it less brittle, bring it into, in this case, I want to be doing more with Drush because I want to make sure that Drush is well aware of, I can send it commands like go get me yesterday's backup and put that onto a machine. So I'm going to have some Drush scripts. But then Chef, it might just be run this Drush command. So it doesn't mean that Chef is necessarily doing anything fancy. It's just running a custom script.
Right. Thanks.
Hi. How concerned do I need to be with the operating system that I'm going to apply the changes to? So if I've got, say, one server running Debian and another server running Fedora.
You don't actually need to be that consistent. You will find lots of recipes that work fine on anything. So for instance, let's take the Apache recipe. You might have an Apache recipe that runs on Fedora and Debian. Now those are completely different packaging systems. If you spin up two servers, one of which is Debian and one of which is Fedora, nothing about them is the same. But Chef says, I've been told to put Apache on. And it knows how to use apt, and it knows how to use yum. And it actually can, because the recipe is smart enough to have pieces to deal with both of them, will go and get what you've told it to. So for instance, if you tell it, go get this version of Apache, and it's available for both of them, let's just assume that, it will go and it will install the software. It's coming completely from different sources, but you may not care about that. You might actually need to have, for support purposes, let's say, 2 completely different machines that are running the same version of Apache. It can build both of them with one recipe.
So in the actual recipe, would you specify what the package name is? So obviously on Fedora, it'd be HTTPD, and Ubuntu, Apache 2.
Yes, in fact, that's one of the things you can build into your recipes is platform-dependent code. You can say, in the case of the node is this platform, go do this. In the case of it's that platform, go do that. Sometimes there are commands that are agnostic. So for instance, there's the package command. Package install Apache 2. That might be the only thing that Chef needs to know to install Apache 2, for instance. But it then knows the package command, which is itself basically telling it how to do something. It's a resource. It's go install something. It then goes and it goes to the underlying code and it knows, oh, I've been told to install it, but I'm on a yum system or an app system or whatever, and handles it appropriately.
Okay, thank you.
Or let's say it's a Windows box. You might have a script that goes ahead and says, go grab a Windows installer. If that's in the recipe, you could have a thing that installed Apache onto a Windows box. And it might be the same exact recipe that somebody had just built to make sure it worked on every platform. All right, that looks like all the questions. So I want to give some thanks. I want to thank Bioraft, great company to work for, giving me the opportunity to be here today. Work for wonderful people, including Nathan, the CEO, and Ben, the CTO. And I want to give a shout out to Michelle Lauer, who's project manager, who helped me put this presentation together. And everybody else at Bioraft. It's a great team to work with. Jim Henson, rest in peace, in doing the Swedish Chef. All of the Opscode people, Drupal developers everywhere. You know, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. Some, like Dries, really are giants. For more information, opscode.com. That should be your first stop. There's so much stuff there. I mean, you could spend hours and hours, and they do have links to all kinds of video presentations. They do a conference, which is a lot like DrupalCon, so there's tons of videos that you can go watch. Tools I think you should check out to continue to build on. Vagrant, absolutely awesome. You should have Vagrant running on your local machine so you can run virtual machines. BORK Shelf, which as I mentioned, is a great way to even speed up developing with Chef. And finally, Behat. There's a bunch of Behat sessions. There was one that happened just before. Hopefully a bunch of you were in there. I'm a huge proponent of Behat. I'd love to see the community really get behind it. I did start groups.drupal.org/Behat, and I'd love to see everybody participate in that. I think that is going to revolutionize how we think about the reliability of Drupal, which is the reason I use Chef to begin with. So that's why I see it's related. So thank you all. And please go fill out the survey because I'd love to come back to another DrupalCon and give another talk. This was great. Thank you. Have we got internet? Let's see. The internet is up. The internet is up. 1 ping if by land, 2 if by sea.